In this video, we will be demonstrating how to attach your GlobalTek accumulation table to the start of your conveyor. We will be attaching a 3-foot table and an 8-foot conveyor, but the same principles apply independent of the size of either machine. The tools you will need are shown here. Once your accumulation table has been unpacked, we will attach the transfer plate to the slot at the start of your conveyor. Slide the knobs attached to carriage bolts, shown here, into the slot. Next, rest the slots and the transfer plate on the bolts. Make sure the washers on the carriage bolts are resting between the knobs and the front of the transfer plate. Tighten the knobs to lock the transfer plate in place, like so. To maximize the space on the conveyor, we recommend positioning the transfer plate as close to the end as possible, about 1 to 2 inches. We will now level the table before we move it into place. Place your level on the line between 2 of the mounting posts, shown here. Do the same thing in the perpendicular direction. Get a sense for which of the legs of the accumulation table need to be raised or lowered for a smooth, level surface. To adjust the height of a leg of the accumulation table, loosen the height adjustment nut on the foot of that leg using a 15/16 wrench. Next, use a 7/8 wrench to turn the foot jam nut, located on the top of the foot. Turn it clockwise to lengthen the leg, or counterclockwise to shorten it. Once you've leveled your accumulation table, move it into place, nesting the curve of the tabletop in the curve of the transfer plate mounted to your conveyor. Raise or lower your table accordingly so that the surface is level to or slightly above the height of the transfer plate. Make sure that the ends of the circular guide rail are placed over the transfer plate. We will later be cutting an opening here, so it is important to cut the ends of the guide rail instead of the middle. This will keep the guide rail in one piece. Once the feet have been adjusted and the table is level, tighten the adjustment nut on all 4 legs with the 15/16 wrench. Plug in your accumulation table and turn it on to make sure it's working. Listen for any scratching noises. If you hear any, this means that your table is grinding against your transfer plate. To stop this, move your table slightly until you no longer hear the scratching. Our conveyor and table are now properly positioned, but we need to modify the guide rails on both to allow for a smooth transfer. We will do this by bending this conveyor guide rail to catch and funnel the containers from the accumulation table onto the conveyor. Place 2 of your containers on your conveyor and table respectively, aiming for about a 45-degree angle between the 2. Mark on this side of the container on the conveyor to designate where you'll make your bend. Measure the distance from this mark to the container on the table. The bent bottom guide rail should ultimately protrude about a container's width into the rotating disc, so that it catches and funnels one container at a time. Measure and mark this distance on the bottom conveyor guide rail to make sure you will have enough material. We recommend overestimating the measurement to ensure you have at least that much or more. We can always cut off any excess. We need to cut an opening in the accumulation guide rail for our containers to pass through. Mark at the intersection between the tape and the accumulation guide rail, as shown here. Mark upstream of this point about 1.5 to 2 container widths away to finish marking the opening you are creating. When finished marking, we will cut our accumulation and conveyor guide rails in these spots. And bend our conveyor guide rail in this spot, so that our containers can pass through. Next, remove the guide rail on the conveyor that is closest to the accumulation table, by loosening the jam nuts on the conveyor clamps using a 1/2-inch wrench. After you remove the conveyor guide rail, loosen, but do not remove the jam nuts on the accumulation table guide rail, by using a 1/2-inch ratchet. Remove the accumulation guide rail once the jam nuts are loose. We will now bend our conveyor guide rail using a conduit bender. You can find a conduit bender at your local hardware store. The conduit bender features an arc with varying degree lines and an arrow that designates where you should begin your bend. Point this arrow directly at your mark. Place the guide rail against a solid surface and bend it using the conduit bender. Be sure that you're bending it in the right direction. When you've reached the 45-degree point, flex the rail a few times to make sure the bend sticks. Remember to bend your guide rail towards the steel side, we want the plastic side to catch the containers. Cut the guide rails that need cutting with a vise and a hacksaw, like so. Cut using precise and clean strokes along your marks. Reattach the accumulation guide rail by refastening it to the clamps on the mounting posts. To adjust the height of the accumulation guide rail, loosen, but do not remove the jam nut on the back of the mounting posts using a 1/2-inch socket. Once loose, the guide rail clamp can move up or down accordingly. Tighten the jam nut using the 1/2-inch socket once the guide rail has been adjusted. Reinstall your newly modified conveyor guide rail by loosening the adjustment nut on the mounting bracket with the 1/2-inch wrench. Install the bent guide rail, like so, and tighten the adjustment nut with the 1/2-inch wrench. To adjust the height of your guide rails, loosen the black knobs on the sides and slide the guide rails up and down along the mounting slots. To adjust the width, loosen the black knobs on top of the brackets to allow the mounting rods to slide in and out. Once the conveyor guide rails are properly adjusted, make sure the black knobs have been tightened. Don't be afraid to trim the guide rails in places to perfect the flow of the stream. Your conveyor and table system should end up looking something like this. Finally, place your containers on the outer ring of your accumulation table and watch as they funnel onto your conveyor. If excess volume or disorganization of containers on your accumulation table is a problem, we recommend an unscrambler, shown here. This device is attached to the table and pushes containers to the outer edge of the table to be picked up. For more information on installing your unscrambler, please see our video tutorial on the subject.